Welcome to Beneath the Surface, the Dark Side of Crime, where we delve into the most chilling true crime cases, uncovering the twisted motives behind the acts that shock the world. In today's episode, we're diving deep into the case that shook the small Appalachian town of Pike County, Ohio, a story of jealousy, conspiracy, and an unimaginable betrayal. The Rhoden family massacre, one of the largest and most brutal murders in Ohio's history, still haunts the community to this day. What would drive one family to wipe out another, leaving behind only blood and heartbreak? Let's find out. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on future chilling true crime stories. Chapter 1. The Rhoden Family, A Quiet Life Shattered. In the rolling hills of Pike County, Ohio, the Rhoden family was a symbol of perseverance and tradition. The area, known for its rugged beauty and tight-knit communities, had long been home to hard-working families who had learned to live with the land. It wasn't an easy life. Pike County was one of the most economically challenged areas in Ohio, with nearly a quarter of its population living below the poverty line. Yet, despite these hardships, the Rhodens had managed to build a life together. Christopher Rhoden Sr. was the backbone of the family. At 40 years old, he had the weathered look of a man who had spent his life working the land. He was a devoted father to his 3 children, Clarence Frankie Rhoden, Chris Jr., and Hannah Rhoden. His cousin, Gary Rhoden, was a frequent companion, and together they navigated the difficulties of rural life. Christopher's eldest son, Frankie, had a young family of his own. His fiancée, Hannah Hazel Gilly, was by his side, and they had a 4-month-old daughter together. Life was hard, but it was theirs, and they were united in their love for one another. The Rhoden family lived on a farm on the outskirts of Piketon, where 3 trailers formed the heart of their compound. It was a place where memories were made and passed down through generations. But that night, the peace of the Rhoden family would be shattered forever. The killers would come without warning, and by the time the sun rose on April 22, 2016, 8 members of the Rhoden family would be dead. A community that had always prided itself on its unity would be thrust into a nightmare that none could have predicted. Chapter 2. The Morning After. Discovery of Horror. The morning of April 22, 2016, began like any other for Bobby Jo Manley, Christopher Rhoden Sr.'s sister. Bobby Jo had always helped out on the farm, feeding the animals in the morning and checking on things. But this day would be different. The moment she walked into the first trailer, she knew something was wrong. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. No voices, no sounds of movement. As she entered the home, she found her brother, Christopher, dead. His body lay sprawled on the floor, a grotesque scene of violence. 9 gunshots had pierced his body, 5 to his face, 3 to his torso, and 1 in his arm. His defensive wounds indicated that he had tried to protect himself, but it had been futile. Bobby Jo's screams echoed through the property as she discovered Gary Rhoden in a similar state, his body cold and lifeless. 3 gunshot wounds to the head, no signs of a struggle. It was clear that he hadn't seen it coming. In a daze, Bobby Jo called 911, her voice shaking as she relayed the horror unfolding in front of her. "There's been a murder. So many murders," she stammered. Authorities rushed to the scene as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Chapter 3. The First Victims. Murder in their Bedslaw enforcement poured into the property, swarming each of the trailers, searching for answers, looking for any sign of evidence that could point them to the killers. The first trailer had been home to Christopher Rhoden Sr., and it was clear that his death had been brutal. But the next discovery would be just as chilling. In the second trailer, Frankie Rhoden and his fiancée, Hannah Gilly, lay in bed. The couple had been killed while they slept, shot without warning. Frankie had been struck 3 times in the head, and Hannah had been shot in the eye, and 4 more times. Their 4-month-old daughter was found between them, unharmed. The scene was eerily calm, the baby lying in the same place as if she had been untouched by the violence that had consumed her parents. But it wasn't just Frankie and Hannah who were victims. Their 3-year-old child had been asleep on the floor, untouched by the killers. The contrast between the brutal violence inflicted on the parents and the peaceful slumber of the children was striking. It was a scene that defied explanation. The killers had moved from house to house with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind no signs of struggle and no warning. The community was in shock, unable to comprehend the scale of the massacre. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. No clues, no leads. More officers arrived at the scene. The true scale of the horror began to unfold. Investigators scoured the area for any clues that could lead to the identity of the killers. But there was nothing. No shell casings, no signs of forced entry. Even the family's dogs, who were usually protective and aggressive toward strangers, hadn't barked. It was as though the killers had been allowed to enter, welcomed even. There was no evidence of robbery. The victims' cell phones were missing, but nothing else had been taken. The complete lack of struggle and the cold precision with which the murders were carried out pointed to multiple assailants. But who could have done this? Theories began to emerge, with some suggesting the involvement of organized crime. Pike County had seen its fair share of drug busts, and there were whispers of the Rhoden's involvement in illegal activities, including a marijuana grow operation. But no one could say for sure. As the community grappled with the shock of the killings, law enforcement struggled to piece together the fragmented clues. Chapter 5. The Wagners, a dark secret revealed. As the investigation continued, suspicion turned toward the Wagner family. Jake Wagner, the 23-year-old son of Billy and Angela Wagner, had been in a relationship with Hannah Rhoden. The two shared a daughter, Sophia, but their relationship had been marred by jealousy, violence, and control. The Wagners had always kept to themselves, but there were whispers in the community that they weren't as innocent as they appeared. Jake had grown increasingly possessive of Hannah, and their relationship had become toxic. It wasn't long before rumors spread that Jake and his family were planning to take full custody of Sophia. But what could drive a family to commit such a brutal act over custody? Investigators learned that Jake's family had a history with the Rhodens. While they weren't close friends, they had been involved in each other's lives for years, both as neighbors and as occasional partners in crime. But it was clear that something had changed. The Wagners were no longer content to let things play out naturally. They wanted control, and they were willing to do anything to get it. Chapter 6. The Custody Battle. The Motive for Murder. The deeper investigators dug into the relationship between Jake Wagner and Hannah Rhoden, the more they uncovered. The custody battle over Sophia had become a bitter, contentious affair. After their breakup, Jake had become obsessed with the idea of gaining full custody of their child. He believed that he and his family were entitled to raise Sophia, even if it meant killing anyone who stood in their way. Hannah had posted on social media, expressing that she would rather die than give up custody of her daughter. This was the breaking point for Jake and his family. Angela Wagner, Jake's mother, had been secretly monitoring Hannah's social media accounts, and when she saw the posts, she realized that Hannah would never willingly give up her daughter. That's when the plan to kill the Rhoden family was set into motion. Billy Wagner, Jake's father, had a history of making decisions for the family, and he was the one who devised the plan to murder the Rhodens. The Wagners knew that if they could eliminate the Rhoden family, they would be able to claim Sophia without any opposition. Chapter 7. The Plan. Weapons, shoes, and silence. The Wagners were meticulous in their planning. They purchased new shoes that were not their usual size, specifically for this night. They also acquired .22 2-caliber pistols, handguns with silencers to minimize the noise of the shots. The family had been practicing with the weapons in secret, honing their skills to ensure that they would be able to execute the murders without making a sound. In addition to the weapons, the Wagners obtained cell phone jamming devices to prevent any calls for help. The entire family participated in the planning, and the date for the killings was set. The Wagners would carry out their plan on the night of April 21st, 2016, when the Rhoden family would be asleep, unaware of the danger that was coming for them. Chapter 8. The Execution. Death in the Night. The night was darker than usual, a thick blanket of silence that hung over the Rhoden family farm. The Wagners were prepared, too prepared, and the time for action had finally arrived. As the clock struck midnight, the Wagner family set their plan into motion. Billy Wagner drove to the Rhoden property, his pickup truck creaking slightly as it passed over the gravel roads, but the hum of the engine was barely a whisper against the stillness of the night. He had been there many times before, casually visiting Chris Rhoden Sr. under the guise of friendship. This time, however, it was different. He wasn't here to socialize or make a deal. He was here to kill. Billy's mission was clear. He would go inside the trailer, put on an act, and get Chris Rhoden Sr. to let his guard down. Once inside, Billy would pretend to talk about a lucrative drug deal, a plan to convince him that everything was fine, that nothing was amiss. Meanwhile, his sons, Jake and George, waited outside, hidden in the truck. They could hear the sounds of the night, the distant rustling of the trees, and the steady rhythm of their own breath. They knew what was about to happen, and though they had planned it for months, the weight of the moment still sat heavy on them. Inside the house, Billy spoke with Chris as if everything were normal. The two had known each other for years, shared a history, and a quiet understanding that often passed between them. But tonight, Billy wasn't looking to make small talk or strike up a business deal. His gaze was cold, his words measured, like a predator slowly circling its prey. When Billy gave the signal, Jake and George exited the truck, walking toward the trailers with chilling precision. There was no room for hesitation now. Inside the first home, Chris Rhoden Sr. was caught completely off guard. Having trusted Billy for so long, there was no suspicion in his eyes when Billy walked up to him. The first shot rang out in the dead of night, silencing the peaceful farm. The sound of the shot wasn't loud enough to be heard by anyone outside, thanks to the suppressors the Wagners had so carefully acquired. Billy then stepped back as Jake and George moved in, their movements sharp and practiced. The next part of their plan was swift. They did not want to linger, not even for a moment. They knew that the family's lives were being snuffed out with each passing second, but they also knew they had to stay calm, quiet, and controlled. Billy had entered another room to execute his part, but it was Jake and George who would finish the job. As they moved methodically through each trailer, they shot each person without mercy. Frankie, Chris's son, was murdered in his bed with 3 shots to the head. His fiancée, Hannah Gilly, met the same fate, shot through the eye and then multiple times after, her body falling limp next to him. In the final trailer, they killed Chris Jr. and his mother, Dana, with ruthless efficiency. The scene of Dana's brutal death, the 5 shots to her head, was particularly horrifying. Chris Jr. didn't even have a chance to fight back as the bullets tore into his skull. Hannah, who had only recently given birth, was killed with 2 shots to the head, her newborn still clinging to her, nursing at her lifeless body. The killers left in the same silence they arrived in, disappearing into the night without a trace, as though the carnage had never happened. They had executed the plan perfectly, and the only thing that remained was the horror they left in their wake. Chapter 9. The Cover-Up. Disposing of the Evidence. The Wagners had known that getting away with murder would require more than just hiding their weapons. They needed to cover every trace, every piece of evidence that could link them to the crime. The months leading up to the killings had been filled with meticulous preparation. They knew exactly how to erase their footprints, how to destroy anything that might later identify them as the perpetrators. The night of the killings was only the beginning of their cover-up. Once the bloodshed had been completed, the Wagners returned to their truck and made their way back home. But they didn't stop there. They didn't go to bed, didn't try to relax. Instead, they immediately began the next phase of their plan, to erase any evidence that could link them to the murders. Billy, Jake, and George took great care to dispose of their clothing, shoes, and any other items that might tie them to the crime scene. They knew that it would be crucial to remove anything that might be found later: clothes, shoes, the guns used in the killings. They were so careful, in fact, that they bought new clothes and shoes specifically for the night of the murders, clothing that was discarded as soon as they finished their deadly work. But the most critical aspect of the cover-up involved the murder weapons. Billy had a cousin, a fisherman, who often took his boat out on local lakes. The Wagners knew that if they could get rid of the guns and shell casings in a way that would make them disappear, they could avoid being caught. So they took the guns, along with the spent shell casings and the homemade suppressors, and placed them in large gallon buckets. They filled the buckets with cement, creating anchors that would weigh down the evidence and make sure it sank to the bottom of the lake. They handed the buckets to Billy's cousin, who took them out on the boat and cast them into the water. The family thought they had successfully disposed of everything. It was a foolproof plan, so they thought, but their arrogance would prove to be their downfall. Chapter 10. The Confession. Justice served. As time passed, the Wagners did their best to blend into the community, acting as though they were innocent bystanders to the tragedy. They even returned to work at a local trucking company, and for a while it seemed as though they had gotten away with the murders. They were careful, meticulous, and their facade was so convincing that it fooled many. But deep down, the guilt began to weigh heavily on Jake Wagner. Though he had gone through the motions, pretending to be shocked and concerned about the deaths of the Rhoden family, Jake couldn't live with the burden of what he had done. The guilt gnawed at him, especially after the death of his daughter's mother, Hannah. What had started as a way to get what he thought was rightfully his had spiraled out of control, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. Then something happened that changed everything. Jake broke. In the face of mounting pressure, and after months of relentless questioning and investigation, Jake cracked. It wasn't the weight of law enforcement closing in on him that broke his resolve. It was the fear of losing his own family forever. He confessed. Jake Wagner admitted to his role in the murders, telling investigators everything: how the Wagners had planned the murders for months, how they had carefully prepared their weapons and shoes, how they had erased every trace of evidence after the killings. He confessed that he had personally shot 5 of the victims, while the other deaths were the responsibility of his father and brother. His confession implicated Angela Wagner, his mother, in the conspiracy and cover-up, though she had not been physically involved in the killings. In exchange for his confession, Jake received a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty to all 23 charges against him in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Instead, he would serve 8 concurrent life sentences with no chance of parole. Angela Wagner, his mother, was sentenced to 30 years for her role in the conspiracy and the cover-up. Billy and George Wagner still awaited trial, and though they both proclaimed their innocence, the evidence was overwhelming. The Wagners had thought they could get away with murder, literally. They had thought they could erase all evidence, that they could carry out the killings with perfect precision. But in the end, it was their own arrogance that led to their downfall. As Jake Wagner sat in his cell, awaiting his sentence, the weight of his actions sank in. The 8 people he had helped kill, the family he had destroyed, all for custody of a child. The consequences of his actions were now inescapable, and no amount of pleading or regret could bring back the lives that had been lost. Conclusion. Justice at last. The Rhoden family massacre remains one of the most shocking and tragic crimes in Ohio's history. 8 innocent lives were stolen in the dead of night, and the killers were close enough to the family to ensure that no one saw it coming. But despite their careful planning and calculated moves, the Wagners were eventually caught, their facade shattered by a single confession. For the survivors, the journey to healing is long and painful. The community of Pike County will never forget the tragedy that ripped apart a family and left a scar that will never fully heal. But justice, in the end, prevailed. the Wagners are paying for their crimes, and while no sentence can ever undo the damage they caused, it has brought closure to the Rhoden family and the community. Thank you for joining us on this heartbreaking journey through the Rhoden family massacre. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you think of the Wagner's motives and the shocking end to this case? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated on new, chilling true crime stories. Until next time, stay safe and always keep your eyes peeled. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows.